So I realize we went through a lot of material the last time we spoke about discovery-driven planning. So it's actually a very straightforward process, but it can seem very confusing. The best way to learn it is to actually work through an example. So we spent our time last time talking about John and Joanne's spreadsheet that they built, their discovery-driven plan. We've created a sample one for you to use. And you can find that spreadsheet available to you as part of the course. And take a look at the Better Desk case. So if you look at that, you'll notice that there are a series of 5 tabs. The first is the Better Desk story. That outlines for you the details of the case that we discussed last time. So you can see the story of John and Joanne and why they're launching Better Desk, what their venture idea is. The second tab you'll see is the reverse income statement. That's where most of the action is happening in this particular discovery-driven plan, and we'll talk about that in more detail. There's a list of assumptions, which again we discussed, the list of milestones, and then that assumption milestone chart that combines the two together. What I'd like you to do is look at the reverse income statement. If you remember, the first step in discovery-driven planning is to start with your goal. So if you look at the top of the reverse income statement, you'll see that we've done exactly that. So Mr. and Mrs. Smith have a current income of $120,000. Their goal, they're not willing to launch their company unless they can make 15% over that. So you see that 115% there. So you see the total required profits. Right? So that is the first step. And then when you look at the rest of the reverse income statement, as we discussed in the last class, you'll see that using steps 2 and 3 of the discovery-driven process, we work backwards from our goal, thinking about the key activities in our business and outlining those in detail. So that's the reverse income statement. Again, take a little time to look at that. And I want to ask you a couple questions. And this will work best if you pause the video, seriously, and take 15 minutes to go through the model, because really the only way to understand this is to play with this a bit. And I can't guarantee it's error-free. We did our best job to build it out. But go through the model and consider the following. And think about what are the key assumptions in the business. And again, we discussed about ways of finding key assumptions in the previous lecture. And are there any missing costs or line items? So please take a few minutes to pause, go through this, come up with your own answer about what the key assumptions of the business are and whether there are obvious missing lines or costs. When I do this for my students, we actually do this in class, and we actually do pause for 15 minutes to do this. So take a few minutes to do that, and then continue the video when you're ready. Okay, I'll trust that you did not cheat yourself by skipping ahead. This isn't graded, so you can do it however you want. But if you had a chance to look through this, there are some missing costs that I noticed when we were putting this together. We don't have any information about rent. We don't have any information about taxes. There's no line item. The marketing line item is pretty weird because we're taking a percentage of sales for marketing. But don't you usually want to spend marketing dollars up front to stimulate sales? We don't have any information for website. There's no general and administrative expenses. And the sales model seems a little bit odd in terms of how it was built. This is very realistic, these sets of missing assumptions. It's very common to build a model and not have thought about certain key issues. So by spending time going through it, and especially if you're able to do that with somebody else, it lets you find these key missing issues, right? And I may have missed them, or maybe some of them are different than the ones that you have. But this gives you a very powerful method of thinking about what you're missing when you're doing your assumption planning. So we've talked about missing costs and missing line items. What about the key assumptions, the other question I asked? And you may have tried a bunch of different techniques, but the idea of how you surface key assumptions is the same as we discussed in the last lecture. The first thing you do is you can move the numbers in ranges. What I mean by move in ranges, I mean think about what the highest and lowest possible number for each assumption is, and try putting in that highest and lowest number into the model. So one thing that we had in the model, for example, was the average number of desks per order. So if we think that number could range from 2 to 100, put 2 in and put 100 and see how much that affects your outcomes. And in terms of figuring out how big those number changes can be, how big the range of possible assumption numbers could be, you want to think about what John and Joanne actually know. So where would we expect them to know the most and therefore there to be the least uncertainty? In this case, I would imagine that would be around the production and manufacturing of desks because John and Joanne are carpenters. They know that market really well. So maybe the cost per desk, which I think they have is $120, could be between $115 and $125. But it's unlikely they were so bad at pricing from talking to their suppliers that it could be somewhere between $5 and $1,000. On the other hand, sales is something that we know from the case that John and Joanne know much less about. So it's much more possible that the range for things like the number of sales calls per day could be much larger, both minimum and maximum, than what John and Joanne discussed. And you get more information by looking at the quality of the sources. What information do they have? Where is the data for the assumptions coming from? If you want to get fancy, you could do the sensitivity analysis using by moving all of the numbers simultaneously, or you can just move them individually. What you see on the side of your screen, that staircase chart, sometimes it's also called a tornado chart when it's done vertically, is our sensitivity analysis. How much do the profits and the numbers change if we move those numbers up and down in their ranges? And this is just one example. I'm not saying these are the exact numbers because, again, we've made up this case. But you could generate a similar chart by moving those numbers in the ranges and then seeing which one has the largest possible effect. If you're familiar with more advanced techniques like Monte Carlo simulations, which let you run all the numbers and move them simultaneously, this is a chance to do that as well. But again, if you don't know what that is or you don't have experience with it, you don't need to do a Monte Carlo simulation to get answers. A simple sensitivity analysis where you move the numbers in each range, use the highest and lowest figures, and see what effect that has on your outcome is very powerful in and of itself. So the next step in the business would be to match these key assumptions to milestones. So you've just surfaced some assumptions that might be large. Perhaps that's the direct sales price per desk. That might be a very big assumption. So we now have the list of milestones that they're hoping to achieve. And we have these assumptions, and we've now identified our key assumptions. We're going to fill in this chart, and this is something you should take some time to do now, to think about when something like direct sales price per desk could be tested. In this case, we certainly could test it in the market study. And we could probably test it in the mock-up of the sample desk for focus groups and the simulation of sales and marketing. So is that where we want to test this? We have to think about that. And you're going to figure out your key assumptions and key milestones by thinking about which milestones test the most assumptions and how early or late this is in the process of starting our business. So if our big concern is about sales calls and whether or not how many sales calls per day can be made or how many desks per order, you'll notice that if we look at the milestone chart, we don't really test that until fairly late in the business. So perhaps we need to think about a way of pre-selling our product earlier. Maybe we could do this by launching a Kickstarter campaign to see if people will support this desk. Maybe we go out and try and pre-sell to a couple of architect shops and see how many orders we get how many desks we get per order. But there isn't a milestone there to test that until very late in the process. So this gives us the idea that maybe we're not testing key assumptions early enough. So that better desk example is a great way to start building your own model. And again, I've heard from many students who found this a very useful technique for thinking through their business. So even if it's not as complex as the better desk model, you'll still find this to be useful. So I strongly recommend building a discovery-driven plan. And it will take you a couple hours of your time, but it can save you thousands of dollars. And having these numbers makes a big difference in your long-term business. At the same time, the problem with the discovery-driven model is it's steady state, right? And your business is hopefully growing over time. This is not a good way to model future sales growth. It's a good way to look at a steady state model that can give you some insights into your business. It's not necessarily a representation of all the costs and issues that you'll be dealing with. So just remember, the model is just a model. It's a tool for you to use. It's not a religious scripture. So think about using this in that kind of way as one of the tools informing you about your assumptions, the next steps in your business, future plans. And spend some time looking through the Better Desk example to understand how everything's connected and how it works together.